Hello. Bum bum. Okay, so I wanted to watch some video essays or shorter videos, hopefully, on some video game music. I'm finally getting back to my video on the music of Dark Souls, which has been on the back burner for like 5 years now. So I just want to get it out. So I just wanted to see what other people are talking about. I think I'm going to start with this one since this is the first one that came up. And then if anyone has like a video they want me to watch in chat, just pop it in there. So we're going to start with this one. 1 second. Make sure this is coming through.
Whether you're playing Dark Souls or Elden Ring or Bloodborne or even Demon's Souls, the music of the Souls series evokes a consistently depressing atmosphere that colors and fleshes out each game's world. To maintain such a consistent sonic identity, the music follows a musical formula that consistently gets at that somber, nihilistic tone the series is so perfect at conveying. So today, let's take a look at some of the principles behind the Souls series music and prepare to dissect what makes it work. The first and most obvious musical contribution to the atmosphere of these games is that there is no music for like 90% of the experience. The music is saved for a handful of key locations throughout each game as well as each of the many boss encounters. But for just about the entire journey between these key places, you'll find no background music to be found. This colors the whole experience of playing the game. There's a thick sense of hopelessness that runs through each game, a gloom that haunts every aspect from the settings to the plot to the action, and somehow getting your head chopped off by a skeleton for the 50th time with no music to accompany it whatsoever drives home this feeling of nihilism more than any score could ever hope to. The second musical contribution to the series' atmosphere is the approach to orchestration, which is extremely consistent across the series. The sounds of string orchestra.
I'm curious to see what he says because I would say that it's not that consistent across the series, but I guess there are certain things that are consistent, but I'm more concerned with the things that aren't. So, you'll probably say, what use of the choir? I mean, what else is consistent about the orchestration? I mean, it's a pretty standard orchestra most of the time. More string heavy than wind heavy. But even the choir thing, like going back to Demon's Souls had one track with choir. So I don't know about that. It's more consistent now. Like there's more of a consistency with orchestration between Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring than there is between either of those and Demon's Souls. So yeah, curious. Oh, what's up, Cosmos? Welcome.
And choir singing nonsense Latin sounding syllables make up the primary colors in the orchestral palette, with low brass and pounding timpani mixed in when the music needs to push you into full throttle panic mode, and harp used when the music needs to reassure you that it's okay, you're in one of the few truly safe places in the game. Different pieces will emphasize one or another of these elements above the rest, and Sekiro naturally sprinkles a healthy dose of traditional Japanese instruments on top, but generally speaking, the choir and strings define the sound of these games. This is what gives the music its seriousness. Removing the lighter sounds from the orchestra, like winds and high brass, keeps the palette dark, and filling their role in the ensemble in with fake Latin chanting choir makes the music feel ancient. It's perfect for the crumbling ruins and characters with troubled pasts that inhabit these worlds. In Dark Souls 3's...
What is this, the Kitamura Exposed stream? Maybe. It depends on what people are saying. What's up, last protagonist? Yeah, it's a good point what he was saying about leaving out some of the higher. That's actually kind of a nice little point
The
that he made
orchestra,
there.
like winds and high brass, removing the lighter sounds from the orchestra, like winds and high brass, keeps that palette.
I mean, that's a little bit of a simplification, but it is kind of true that generally speaking, there isn't a lot of like flute, clarinet. They do make appearances, but in much more targeted ways. Like you have a flute solo in Sif's theme. Sif's theme sort of alternates between these, these phrases of really big full orchestra and choir, and then it goes back down to the smaller instrumentation of just like violin and harp or flute and harpsichord. I think those are the combos. So you'll get things like that, but yeah, you tend not to have a lot of the really high frequency instruments, trumpet, flute, things like that. So that's actually a pretty good point.
Dark, and filling their role in the ensemble in with fake Latin chanting choir makes the music feel ancient. It's perfect for the crumbling ruins and characters with troubled pasts that inhabit these worlds. In Dark Souls 3's Iudex Gundyr theme, the high choral chords that open the piece give way. To a somber string melody.
I wasn't gonna say anything, but Iudex Gundyr. Yeah, for real. That's not how I would pronounce it.
This ancient, hopeless gloominess that pervades these themes means that the harmony has to be minor, minor, minor. You'd be hard-pressed to find a major chord anywhere in these games. Here we swim around a G minor chord for basically the entire piece, with the melody walking up from the root to the third and jumping up to the fifth to clearly outline this G minor sound. The gorgeous string orchestration isn't afraid to sit on neighboring tones within the G minor scale, using the flat sixth and the second of the key to access the devastating sound of the Aeolian mode, or natural minor scale.
I sometimes take issue with the way that these things are framed. It's like, oh, it's the devastating sound of the Aeolian mode. It's a minor scale. It's not. This is not like anything unusual. So yeah, I don't know. The way that's framed as if it's like, oh, this really special technique, the devastating sound of the Aeolian mode. This is literally just a minor scale.
The theme of Gehrman, the first hunter from Bloodborne.
Also, I think technically this is not still G minor. This is a chord change here. That would be like a 4, a C minor in second inversion. Saito made this one. I don't think this is Saito actually, but it is not Kitamura, that's for sure. I don't know. You can't really rely on YouTube attributions most of the time, but I wonder if someone says it. Oh, this does say Saito. Mic volume lower than intro. Sorry, I'm kind of moving everything around a bit. Hold on. that might be... Ugh, why is this so low? You have the OST from the trilogy release, and it lists Saito. Oh yeah, it does say Saito here. I thought it was someone else. Oops. Moby Games. Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 has like a whole bunch of different composers on it, although most of them only did 1 or 2 tracks. The majority is Kitamura. What? Wait. Dark Souls 3, right? That's weird. Why does it list... Oh, I see. Yuka Kitamura is this... Wait. Nobuyoshi Suzuki. Yeah, so Suzuki, like, he did, I think, the Deacons and maybe another one. I thought that he was the one that did Gundyr. I guess I must have misremembered. Sometimes these attributions are very difficult to parse. They're not always accurate, even on the more official credits. Kokia, she sang the ending song. According to this, it's only Deacons? Interesting. All right.
The theme of Gehrman, the first hunter from Bloodborne, similarly dives deep into the minor scale, laying down a low bass drone on the tonic D note for huge chunks of the piece. Underneath the cello melody outlining simple D minor figures and the inner voice stepping around to more colorful notes from the D minor scale, this bass creates an oppressively dark atmosphere.
Pretty sure that's viola, not cello.
There's something about the sound of the minor key that can feel profoundly dark. If you look at all of the individual parts of Gehrman's theme here, it's incredibly simple. The melody is walking up a D minor scale, the inner voice is moving away from and then resolving back to the third of the key, and the bass is, of course, just sitting on the root. But even though it's simple, it allows for a level of expression from the performers that makes it truly powerful. Sticking so stubbornly to the tonic minor chord like this creates the sense that we can't escape the darkness, which I think could accurately describe the main narrative theme of just about every Souls game. Now, we're not just sitting on one minor chord for most of the music in these games, of course, but when we do see other chords, we see the music take a very specific approach, centering on the sound of the dominant 5 chord. The dominant 5 chord in a minor key, using the raised 7th of the key rather than the flat 7 natural to the minor scale, is a sound that dates back hundreds of years and can evoke a dark classical style that fits perfectly with the settings of each of these games. Nothing in the Souls games feels cutting edge. Everything feels like it's been there for thousands of years and is way past its prime. It's a very old and very basic technique, but when used properly, the dominant 5 chord can surpass the basic gloom of the natural minor scale and get to a real sense of despair. It's an essential part of the sound of the Souls series, especially when used with a specific twist. Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls gives us a perfect example. The harp and strings spell out a progression from the 1 chord, E minor, to the 4 chord, A minor, held over the tonic E in the bass. It then moves to a B7 chord before resolving back to the home chord of E minor.
I wonder if he's going to mention one neat thing about that change, because normally what you'd have here is just a traditional A minor chord, so you'd have a C instead of a D. But by making that a D, what this spells out is E, D, A, which is the 3 notes, the 3-note motif of Gwyn's theme. It's probably a coincidence, but it's kind of funny.
This 5-to-1 cadence has a real finality to it, a real hopelessness that totally fits the character of the game, and you'll notice 2 interesting things about this B7 chord that add to the Dark Souls sound. 1, it has the flat 9th of the chord on top, a C note, making it a B7 flat 9 chord. And 2, it has the 3rd of the chord in the bass, D sharp. Now, borrowing the raised 7th scale degree in a minor key means that if you build up a chord based on this raised 7th, you'll get a diminished 7 chord. In E minor, this would be a D sharp diminished 7. And if you compare this chord to our B7 flat 9 that we saw just before, you'll see that the 2 chords are identical apart from the inclusion of the 5th of the key, in this case, B. Because of this, the 5-7 chord in a minor key is functionally identical to the diminished chord based off of the raised 7th, as they contain all of the same notes. Look at this section from the tower.
That felt like that was sort of explained in an unnecessarily confusing way. You could just say that it's the same. You could literally just skip to the end there and just say it's the same. It's the same notes. That a diminished 7th. A diminished 7th chord is yeah, I guess I don't know. It just seemed like he made that unnecessarily confusing.
Night theme from Demon Souls. This great jagged diminished chord riff in the strings outlines an E flat diminished 7 chord, and then after 4 bars the phrase continues with the bass note shifted down to D underneath. The diminished riff doesn't change at all, but having a D note anchor it turns it from a diminished chord into a D7 flat 9 chord that resolves to G minor. You'll note that because of the symmetrical nature of the diminished chord, E flat diminished is equivalent to F sharp diminished is equivalent to A diminished and C diminished. This is a perfect example of how similar the 7 diminished and dominant 5 chords really are, and how the diminished sound of the 5-7 flat 9 chord can add a more aggressive edge to your usual 5-to-1 cadence. The Souls games do use dominant 5 chords like this, but more often than not they'll be inverted in some way to prevent us from
I'm not really sure what his point is here. I mean, like, so far this section has all been about the fact that Souls music uses dominant chords in a minor key, and that diminished chords and dominant chords use a lot of the same notes. I'm not really like, okay, what's the point? What's the point? I don't really get what that's. What are you hoping to? What does that mean?
Totally getting the cadence's satisfying finality. The Godskin Apostles theme from Elden Ring uses minor 1, 4, and 7 diminished chords all over a tonic E-flat bass pedal. Again, using the 7 diminished is functionally the same as the dominant 5 chord, so you can think of these D diminished chords as basically being B-flat 7s. But putting a D diminished triad over an E-flat bass note rather than a B-flat bass note makes such a great crunchy sound.
Crunchy?
I also want to point out here the way these boss themes tend to rock back and forth between huge, loud intensity and more subdued, quieter phrases. These pieces tend to be structured in 8 or 16 bar phrases and aren't afraid to drop the dynamic way down low for a phrase before bringing it crescendoing back up to an eruption of intensity. I particularly love this passage.
I take issue with that because I feel like they don't do that nearly enough. Maybe something like Godskin Apostles, which is a lot better, but that is one of the issues with the Kitamura style, is this sort of run-on sentence that's all at a consistent volume, consistent level of intensity, doesn't have any direction, and just kind of stays where it is. And you need those points of contrast. So it's weird that he says that they do that, because I feel like it doesn't do that nearly enough.
And aren't afraid to drop the dynamic way down low for a phrase before bringing it crescendoing back up to an eruption of intensity. I particularly love this passage that isolates a couple vocalists harmonizing a melody that moves from the tonic E-flat minor to the much brighter sounding F minor, borrowing that raised sixth of the key, C natural, before sinking back down to a natural minor sound with a darker A-flat minor chord.
I think you missed out. This is actually a half diminished seventh, because the F is still playing. But,
Back to the harmony, Great Grey Wolf Sif's theme from Dark Souls uses tons of...
What do you think of Champion Gravetender? As a boss, I think it's pretty shitty. Musically, let me remind myself how it goes. It doesn't really come to mind, which doesn't give me hope, but let's see. There's that classic Kitamura flair, just like having random chromatic notes that don't make any sense. Like, just listen to that. What? What? Yeah, yeah, you're right. It does sound like the main theme. It does have a, what was it around there? It does sound a bit like the main theme, and I'm not really sure why, because this is like the most unimportant boss in the game, probably. Um, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't have as much of the Kitamura problems in terms of like just random weird notes and mumbling little violin lines, although they're still present to some degree. Um, but you know, it's kind of funny. So like that's a perfect example of where I would say you don't have any of these like drops. It's all just at a consistent volume and intensity. Every phrase is the exact same phrase, just like a slight variant. So there's no feeling of like direction anywhere because it's just the same harmonic progression repeated over and over and over again, and it doesn't, nothing really changes. Like you have tiny changes in the orchestration, and obviously phase 2 sounds a little different because it's but actually what he was talking about with the dominant, going to the dominant chords all the time, that's sort of one of the issues that I really don't like about the Dark Souls music. And it is not really true as much of Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1. There's a lot more interesting harmonic progressions that don't repeat, where it feels like it's actually going somewhere. Whereas starting kind of with Dark Souls 2 and particularly with Dark Souls 3, and then a fair number of tracks from Elden Ring, a lot of the music is just like tonic, dominant, tonic, dominant, tonic, dominant, over and over and over and over again, and just starts to sound all the same. So you compare something like this with, I don't know, just like a random track from, like, let's just listen to Bell Gargoyles from Dark Souls. And so already you have a 4-bar phrase that is almost doing something like you would hear in later Dark Souls games. You kind of, tonic, going subdominant, dominant, is a similar kind of chord progression, but then it changes into something else. So you already have like way more variety in just, 20 seconds than in an entire track, because you start with one phrase, these big chords, with also an unusual instrumentation. You've got the harpsichord, which is like a huge part of the sound of Dark Souls 1 and completely gets shafted in Dark Souls 2 and 3. But you have these 4 chords, then you have this weird little phrase that's like totally chromatic and weird, and it sounds like everything's falling apart. Then it goes to a bunch of unisons where everybody's playing the same sort of falling figure, and then it goes to an F sharp minor, so now we've changed key already. So it's like already there's way more stuff going on in the first 20 seconds. Like, Now change. Change again. Change. And then back to this. So and also, you know, odd phrase structures. It's not just like 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. These like extending some of them, shortening some of them. There's just way more variety, and I think that's like, regardless of which one is better, I feel like people forget that Dark Souls 1, like this, the sound of Dark Souls or the sound of the Souls games is something that it's like the Dark Souls 3 soundtrack is almost like a caricature of it, but it misses out on all of these different elements that the actual Dark Souls soundtrack had. And it's not just Sakuraba, because Sakuraba's tracks in Dark Souls 3, the few that he did, are like really terrible. Probably some of the worst tracks, even worse than Kitamura's. Things like what is it? The Crystal Sage is just atrocious. What I think he did Wolnir and the Curse Rotted Greatwood, and they're just terrible. So it's not just like, and my suspicion is that he was kind of pulled in later in development, and who knows? It's always hard to tell what happens behind the scenes, because I don't know if, like, it could be also if where is it? If Kitamura was the lead sound designer, like in Dark Souls 1, it was Yuji Takenouchi, and he also wrote like the character creation music and did all the editing and stuff. So who knows if it's, how much of it is to do with the actual composers versus the direction, maybe direction from Miyazaki, a lot of different things. Did I like any tracks from Shadow of the Erdtree? Yeah, I liked a lot of the tracks, actually. Midra's theme I thought was great. The Shadow Altus, or no, wait, not Shadow Altus. Shadow Altus I hated. Gravesite Plain. The Gravesite Plain is probably the best ambient track in the whole game, I think. And there was more variety. I think they made an effort to have more variety. Things like Meteor and particularly the second phase of Promised Consort Radahn, like those are unusual. Those don't really sound like any of the other tracks. So, and there were some nice little callbacks, like Rellana's theme quoting Renala's, and Messmer's theme quoting Radagon's, and little things like that. So, but yeah, it was a bit more interesting. With the Shadow Altus is the only one that I didn't like. The rest of them I was sort of, you know, I had no strong feelings, or I liked them. So anyway, back to this video.
Dominant 5 chords in. Back to the harmony, Great Grey Wolf Sif's theme from Dark Souls uses tons of dominant 5 chords in first inversion, putting the third of the chord in the bass, much like what we saw in Firelink Shrine's music earlier. Notice again the way the music breaks down to a lower dynamic and sparser texture before building back up to the intensity of.
Yeah, that's because it's Sakuraba. Sakuraba does that. Shinsuke Kida does that. The other composers don't.
The full ensemble. These first inversion 5 chords do resolve up to their tonic 1 chords,
Bro,
but
you
they're
definitely
also
rolled too
used
early
in the
there.
Souls series to slide down to the flat 7 of the key in a kind of fake-out move. This later section of Sif's theme sees the tonic of the moment, E minor, move to a B over D sharp chord, which slides down to a D chord before returning up to a B7 flat 9 over D sharp that resolves back to E minor. The B7 flat 9 over D sharp, just like what we saw in Firelink Shrine, accesses the unstable and aggressive diminished chord sound by adding the flat 9th C to mimic a D sharp diminished 7 chord. Actually, this example is more crunchy than a straight up diminished 7
More crunchy?
chord would be, thanks to the rub between the root B and the flat 9th C that happens above the D sharp bass note. Sticking pretty strictly to these kinds of chord progressions, variations on 5-1 and 7-1 cadences creates such a strong sonic identity.
Hey Crunchy, I know you said Sakuraba did the worst tracks for DS3, and while I agree, would you say Nameless King was one of the bad ones? I remember Nameless King being more interesting, actually. That is right, he did do Nameless King. That's crazy. I never realized that. That's funny. They use the same. It's the same. Is that like the dragon motif? Dum bum 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 bum. That's the dragon motif. Dark Souls is the Elden Ring universe confirmed. Yeah, I mean it's not Sakuraba's best track, but it is there's just more going on in something like this than most of the Dark Souls 3 tracks. Like harmonically, I don't know if I could break it down on the fly, but like let's see. So there's like E minor, E major. Let's see here. So there's E minor, then E dominant 7, A minor, then D sharp diminished, then F sharp minor. And now it's doing the same thing starting on F sharp instead of starting on E. It's got like direction to it. It's not always, because the problem is when you do the same, the Dark Souls chord progression, like what we heard with the, what was it, Champion Gravetender. Something like this is like... So there, you ending on this dominant chord. So it always, we're in D minor here. So it's always coming back to D minor. Every single phrase, it's like D minor, we go to a dominant chord, and then we come back to D minor, and we do the whole thing again. And so the problem is that that's your home base. So you feel like you're just always coming back to the same place. It's not going anywhere. And when you have just a little bit more interesting harmony, something like this, it feels like it's actually leading to something because the harmony is changing. You're not just staying in the same place. And then again, he does, once you finish that section, we go on to a section that's got different instrumentation, different harmony, some different vibe to it altogether, which just keeps everything interesting. And I think that's especially important for Dark Souls 1, where you don't have the adaptive music for different boss phases, or you don't really have different multi-phase bosses besides Ornstein and Smough, but keeping things flowing and just interesting, there's like direction in the music. That's way more important when the music is just continuing onwards. And it may be that transitioning over to the model that they have now, where you've got a first phase theme and then a second phase theme, and then it kind of adaptively goes between them, that might be it might give them permission to make the music less interesting, because you've got the progression built into the structure of the boss fight, rather than like making the music feel like it's leading somewhere. Anyway.
Identity for the series, but such a limited harmonic palette of B, thanks to the rub between the root B and the flat ninth C that happens above the D sharp bass note. Sticking pretty strictly to these kinds of chord progressions, variations on 5-1 and 7-1 cadences creates such a strong sonic identity for the series, but such a limited harmonic palette could start to get old across a series of soundtracks. To create more musical drama in the places that need it without compromising the established harmonic identity of the series, lots of pieces will change keys on a dime, throwing out the same kind of 5-7-1 moves in a variety of minor keys in quick succession, especially in the tracks written by Motoi Sakuraba, who did the entirety of Dark Souls 1 and most of Dark Souls 2. These key shifts can be pretty insane. Thankfully, diminished 7 chords work wonderfully for changing keys, their instability translating to a flexibility that proves very useful for this. Dark Souls 2's theme for Sin, the Slumbering Dragon, starts off with big, grandiose orchestra chords giving us a G major that turns sour and becomes a G minor. This opening statement gives way to a series of key changes that eventually dumps us in the key of A minor, and we see this A minor chord dip down to a G sharp diminished 7, which sets up a resolution back to A minor. But instead of this resolution, we slip down another half step to G minor, and then move to C minor in what feels like a solidification of G minor as the new home key. This C walks down to an A7 flat 9 almost immediately, though, which resolves to a D minor chord, which then immediately shifts to a C diminished 7 to bring us back to that initial grandiose statement.
I'm happy he is actually pointing out that this is, like, Sakuraba does do these more interesting harmony. Not an amazing chord progression or anything, but, like, it's just more interesting. There's more happening, more variety.
The theme for everyone's favorite gruesome twosome, Ornstein and Smough, takes us through the keys of G minor, E minor, F minor, and F sharp minor, all through just 16 bars. We start in G minor with yet another melody that walks straightforwardly up the minor scale, while the harmony dips down to a first inversion 5 chord, this D over F sharp. This smoothly transitions to a D sharp diminished 7 chord that brings us to the key of E minor, jumping to our new first inversion 5 chord, B over D sharp, before pivoting back to G minor where we started. This last D over F sharp facilitates a smooth bass step down to F to bring us to the key of F minor, where we get a longer walk down from the 1 chord to the 5 chord, C, setting up a jump back to F minor. But we overshoot that resolution just a hair and end up in F sharp minor, trading the tonic chord with its 7 diminished E sharp diminished 7. This once again facilitates a smooth step down to an E chord, and the bass keeps walking down to get us to a C sharp diminished 7. After this, the piece breaks down to a quieter organ solo section back to the first key of G minor. See if you can follow along with all of these key changes here. This music...
There's like random little mistakes in his transcription, which, like, you know, no big deal, but that slightly bugs me.
doesn't let up any more than the bosses who it accompanies do. Whether it's hectic boss themes, poignant story-heavy battles with tragic figures, or a rare place of rest in a dangerous world, the music that runs through the Souls games sticks to a very specific sound to create the perfect atmosphere for their worlds. These games are full of broken characters.
No worries, Cosmos. Have a good night. Also, hey, Ace Roy and Saucy. Check out his work on the Golden Sun soundtrack. Alright, maybe I'll check that out next.
Characters in tragic, hopeless settings, and it's no easy feat to capture the gravity of these games' themes with such tact. Surprisingly, even with using such a limited palette of musical colors and techniques, the series manages to create a ton of unique, hauntingly beautiful tracks with each release. Much like the design of each game, the skeleton is always pretty much the same, even as the details change. But it's such a great skeleton that we just can't get enough, no matter what the details are on top. Big thanks to patron Daigo for requesting a Souls series overview. If you want to see my full transcriptions for the tunes shown in the video, head on over to my Patreon and become a $5 supporter. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.
Yeah. There was some good stuff in this. I feel like it kind of lost the point as it was going on. So what was this point? Why does Dark Souls sound like Dark Souls? No music. I mean, that's a big part of it, is not having music for most areas and combat, besides bosses. Orchestration, he made a good point with the lack of sort of high-pitched winds and brass. And then the standard stuff, choir and strings and percussion and low brass. That's pretty consistent. This stuff about like the dominant chords, I mean, that is true of something like Dark Souls 3 and a lot of Elden Ring. I feel like a lot of the tracks, though, like, it's not like using dominant chords is a crazy thing, like doing tonic dominant. That's the most basic this isn't like if you're trying to figure out why does Dark Souls sound like Dark Souls, it seems weird to pick something which is true of like a lot of music. You'd want to find something more specific to the Souls sound. So that it seems weird to spend a lot of time focusing on like, oh yeah, there's a lot of dominant chords. And the specific like examples that he gave, well, see, he did mention that like, oh, sometimes there's more interesting harmonic progressions, so it's not really all dominant. I don't know, this felt a little more confused. And the fact is that there isn't really a consistent sound. That's part of the problem, is like Dark Souls 1 doesn't really sound like Dark Souls 3 beyond, you know, beyond the very basics, you know, music in a minor key with choir and full orchestra. Besides that, there aren't many things that are consistent. Demon Souls doesn't really sound like any of the rest. Bloodborne is totally different. Sekiro is totally different. I mean, like, just for example, that dominant chord thing, like Gwyn's theme, maybe one of the most famous tracks in the whole series. There's no dominant chords in that. There's not. I mean, not a modally borrowed dominant. Not a leading tone dominant. It's all natural minor. So yeah, it's just kind of an odd trailing off here with all of this stuff. It was good to point out with Ornstein and Smo how it changes all the time, how the sort of the tonal center changes. That is one of the key features of that track, I think. So what am I looking up? Ayers Rock from Golden Sun. This is a cool track. I think I gotta play Golden Sun. I know that always pops up as like, that's one of those classic games, and even though I played a ton of Game Boy games, I never got around to it. Oh, is this like the sequel, The Lost Age? So let's see. What would be a good video game music? Let's just look up that and see what. No, let's see. Video game music essay, something. The power of video game music. What looks interesting? Adaptive soundtracks in games. I've seen this video actually. New stream. Yeah, I think Golden Sun is on my big list. Video game music is better than the music you like. I hate these videos that are framed like this. It's better than you remember, your all that kind of stuff. Why do horror games sound so beautiful? Well, let's look up. Let's see if anybody has anything about Elden Ring. I can't watch any of these. How Elden Ring surpassed the Dark... Oh, this is like an hour long. I'm not going to watch that. Does anyone have anything interesting to say about it? I guess we could watch another 8-bit music theory. Let's see this. What is it about Ludwig? What's that? Gavin Leaper and Ongaku Concept are other channels who cover game music. Okay, let's see. Gavin Leaper. This looks potentially more interesting. Oh, we watched the Bernstein lectures. This looks potentially interesting. Learning music theory with Ocarina of Time.
Hey there, good morning from Tokyo. Today we are going to be talking about Zelda Ocarina of Time, which I'm extremely excited about. Yeah, I don't really like Zelda at all. The origin of this is actually that a friend of mine got me this book. So it's called Zelda Best Collection. It has...
I think I want to look more... I might actually look up this guy, but I want to find something that's a bit more of a video essay. How to use the Lydian mode? Now let's stay with Souls. Let's see. How Dark Souls best boss theme works. Why you can't forget Gwen's theme. Oh, this is 40 minutes? No, let's watch this shorter one.
Dark Souls is glorious. The way the music is used in the series has always served to elevate the absolute cinema, battles to the death. The open world is completely silent so that when that boss music hits, it's pure bliss. If you can get that far into the fight. Yeah, Pinwheel's a boss fight that's likely to end within 5 or so hits from that claymore you got on the bridge on the way to Undead Parish. So you probably didn't know how brilliant and haunting this musical piece really is. Like the title says, Pinwheel's theme is kinda sick, and I wanted to show you some of the techniques that you can steal and apply to your own compositions. We'll be taking a look at 3 main elements that make this tune so chilling: the structure, the melody, and texture.
I wouldn't have expected to pick Pinwheel's theme. That's really odd. I mean, there are some nice things in Pinwheel's theme, but out of all of Dark Souls, okay.
Starting with structure, well, that one's kind of easy. The piece moves in nice, clean 4-bar sections with instruments entering and exiting as things proceed. Honestly, it's the least tense thing about the theme, but it allows for an easy time to keep up with all the weirdness that happens in the melody. A low C pedal from strings supports the interplay between
I didn't even... Wait, structure... What about the structure? That it's got 4-bar phrases?
a nice, clean 4-bar sections with instruments entering and exiting as things proceed. Honestly, it's the least tense thing about the theme, but it allows for an easy time to keep up with all the weirdness that happens in the melody. A low C pedal from strings supports the interplay between a shamisen and a harp. This is the main idea that we'll be returning to later on in the piece in a few different ways. Looking at the notes, the melody comes from a really unique scale that I've summed up to be some sort of C melodic minor with a sharp 4. Normally, C melodic minor is spelled C, D, E flat, F, G, A, B, C. But there's an intentional use of F sharp that pops up all over the place in this initial idea. This gives us even more otherworldly notes to choose from. The plucked instruments add a tense texture to the opening theme. Considering we're interrupting a madman's necromancy experiment, it really gives us the feeling that we shouldn't be here. Whispered vocals swirl around as another eerie texture. Many players swear they can hear the voices saying things like, "I'm sorry," and "help me," as if we're hearing the fused abomination's regret.
Yeah, people have said that, and I feel like that's probably just, what do you call it? Pareidolia? Pareidolia? Dolia? We're just hallucinating it because you think it would make sense.
For trying magic that should never be touched. The opening motifs continue in the next 4 bars, with addition of long flute tones and violins jockeying for position as the main idea. Flute is usually an instrument that lives comfortably in the higher range, so it's rare to hear it played so low. Down here, the texture hits in a way that builds anxiety. Pinned up with the harp and the newly entered harpsichord, and we end up with some nasty clashes. In the next section, we get introduced to some brand new material in a vocal choir sample. The extreme low to high range gives a texture that's reminiscent of Super Metroid, specifically the Crateria theme. We hear violins take over.
It's kind of random. I feel like this is, I don't know, I'm not really interested in watching the rest of this. There's some good points, and honestly, the transcriptions are better than 8-bits, but I'm just not really getting a lot out of this. There's really not a lot out there. Okay, let's see. What was the other one? Why You Can't Forget Quincy. Oh, that was really long. This one, Dark Souls Music Analysis.
Hi, my name is Cameron Steele, and this is a show on video game music. So lately, I've been playing Nioh, and it got me thinking about the music in Dark Souls. Not the music that you're thinking about though. I mean this kind of music. Let me explain. Silence is a really effective tool when writing music for games. Sometimes the sound effects and the voices are enough, or in some cases are even better than if you were to have music. Silence can also be used for emphasis. If a game has lots of music and then cuts to nothing, it can sound eerie and creepy. It can make you focus your attention on the actions of a scene rather than the emotions being portrayed in the music. It is especially good at creating nostalgia. Dark Souls 3 already does this with the final boss fight, where the music is a rearranged version of the final boss theme from Dark Souls 1. Now let's talk about silence, and how does Dark Souls use it? Well, it uses it a lot, like, most of the time. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a bad thing. It was clearly a choice made for the game's atmosphere, but let's look a bit deeper and see if there's anything to gain by adding music to a game like Dark Souls. First, let's have a look at some examples of music in a mostly silent game. In Nioh, there is mostly silence, just like Dark Souls. However, in some later missions, the game changes a bit. In the mission, The Ocean Roars Again, ambient music starts playing right after you light this torch.
Where you couldn't have, like, I don't know, does Nioh have separate channels for sound effects and music? Because, like, I can barely hear this.
I felt like this separated it from Dark Souls because it really emphasizes the Japanese aspects of this game.
Wait, what?
This torch. I felt like this separated it from Dark Souls because it really emphasizes the Japanese aspects of this game.
The using music after lighting a torch emphasizes the Japanese aspects of the game? What?
In Bloodborne, if you die to this guy, he takes you to a later area in the game called Yargul. You're thrown into a completely new area with strong enemies and a menacing choir that makes the fear even stronger. In a completely optional area of the game, the Upper Cathedral Ward, you are in a grand hall that is very dark and filled with werewolves and monsters in the shadows.
I actually forgot about this.
The music here is also trying to creep you out, with the violin screeching mixed with the unknown darkness. Now let's move on to how we could use it in Dark Souls. The first example is going to be using nostalgia, just like in the final boss fight, but instead we're going to use it in a well-known area of the game, Anor Londo. Anor Londo is a very well-known and remembered part of Dark Souls 1. It's a huge castle area and has some of the best and worst moments in the game. So why not attach some sort of starting theme to this area? Obviously this would get annoying if you died a million times, so let's simplify it. There we go. Nice and simple. Now, when you play Dark Souls 3, after the terribly annoying Archer section, you'll come to this area and it will trigger your memory just a tad.
You hate it? Yeah, I hate it too.
And you'll be like, I think I remember this place. Then comes the big spiral staircase, which is also familiar, followed by an area that everyone who played Dark Souls 1 would remember, and bam. This would have been very powerful.
No, it would not be very powerful. That would be terrible. First of all, because there's no electric guitar in the Dark Souls soundtrack, so you're introducing some random element. And second, because Anor Londo does have a theme. Did everyone forget this? That's your Anor Londo theme. And yeah, that is the beginning of Ornstein and Smough, although it resolves differently. And that also makes sense because that's Gwendolyn's motif. And so actually that does come back in Dark Souls 3 when you return to Anor Londo, because the music for Aldrich oops. So, what he was talking about already exists in the game, and it's a lot better. Yeah, I don't know if I can go back to that video. I think I'll maybe just watch that other 8-bit one. Dark Souls 8-bit. Oops, not writing anything. Dark Souls 8-bit. what was it? How Dark Souls turns motifs into music.
Dark Souls is a game that doesn't waste any part of its experience. The story of the game is told through everything, from the environments to the enemy designs to the loading screens. The game's systems for leveling up, currency, and punishment for death all use the same resource. Even the layout of the game's world is structured in such a way that you're constantly retreading old ground. The music is consistent with this philosophy. Rarely do we hear elaborate intros or static background music. In fact, we rarely hear background music at all. When there is music, though, it takes a small number of musical elements and makes the most of them. Today, I want to talk about how to take a few musical ideas and turn them into a larger piece. I'm sure I've mentioned these before, but here's a quick overview for newcomers. In music, the term motif refers to the smallest possible musical idea that can still be recognized as a unique idea. Motifs are a fundamental building block composers use to construct pieces that sound completely coherent without being repetitive, as the ear can latch onto recurring motivic figures that emphasizes a piece's identity even as they evolve throughout the piece. Furthermore, if you know how to manipulate a small motif into a larger musical idea, it makes the composition process much less rage-inducing. For an example, let's look at Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, the music that plays during the final boss fight in Dark Souls. If that weren't enough of a hint, there are going to be spoilers for the final boss fight in Dark Souls, just so you know. This theme is surprising, to say the least. On a soundtrack full of pounding orchestral boss fight music, you'd expect the grand finale to be the poundiest of all. Instead, we get this delicate piano piece, which evokes less pulse-pounding action and more crushing loneliness. It's a beautiful piece, which adds a lot to the Dark Souls narrative in itself, with its implication of the tone of this last boss battle.
But who cares about narrative? I want to talk about motifs.
The piece is 2.5 minutes
What?
long, but it's really built out of 2 small melodic motifs. It can be a little overwhelming trying to write even 1 minute of music from scratch, but if you know how to effectively elaborate on a musical idea, you can get away with writing 15 seconds of music and stretching it out however long it needs to be. A key element in this process is structuring the song as a whole. As I'm sure you know, any piece of music is going to be made up of different sections like verses or choruses or what have you. We can break Gwyn's theme down into 3 main sections, which I'll call A, B, and C. Phrase A is a simple elaboration on our first 3-note motif, 5-4-1. This isn't exactly a revolutionary melodic idea, it's basically just 1 note different from a 5-1, but the rhythm keeps things interesting by keeping beat 1 completely empty. So how does this 3-note motif get stretched into a full 8-bar phrase? One way to do it is to state it as a melodic idea and then state a variation of that idea. It doesn't have to be anything complicated. In fact, you don't have to change very much at all. Instead of this 4th leap down to 1 in the motif, we invert it to get a 4th leap up to the flat 7 in the variation. This extends the phrase in a very natural way. To finish off the phrase, we get this walk down back to the E where we started, and then the last 3 bars are kept empty. Motoi Sakuraba, the composer for Dark Souls, could have handled this a few different ways. He could have repeated the first motif and ended on the 1. But that feels too final and loses momentum. He could have maybe used another variation of his motif to extend the phrase even longer while still landing on the 5th. But this would have filled up the rest of the 8 bars. The fact that he kept half of the phrase melodically empty was a careful decision that I think serves 2 purposes. First, keeping the melody sparse serves to emphasize the loneliness and isolation of the subject, Gwyn. Gwyn was once a powerful god, but it has been thousands of years since he gave up his soul to rekindle the first flame, and what we see when we meet Gwyn in the game is an empty husk of his former glory, desperately trying to hold the coming age of darkness at bay just a little longer. This boss fight isn't supposed to feel like an epic finale so much as like putting down an old, sick dog.
Lore? More like bore. Let's get back to music theory.
Okay. This open space leaves lots of
It's incredibly annoying. But this is actually a very good analysis so far. It was nice to see like those alternate versions of what you could have done with that motif. Yeah.
Lots of room for further variations to expand upon the melody later in the song, and we see Sakuraba capitalize on this towards the end of the piece. Phrase B is twice as long as phrase A at 16 bars, and is based off of our second 3-note motif. This phrase is a little less straightforward with how it uses its motif, as we start with this pickup note emphasizing our fifth, E, before this 3-note walk-up plays out. Now that we've heard our second motif, it's time for the variation. Instead of walking up the scale, once again the line is inverted from the original, walking down to the second, B. Ending on the second allows the piece to keep the same sense of unrest and forward momentum as ending on the fifth, because they're both chord tones of our dominant chord, and they don't feel totally resolved. Another interesting aspect of this variation is the lack of beat 1, an element clearly taken from our original motif back in the A section. Blending established motifs together like this does a lot to make a piece feel more cohesive. The rest of the first 8 bars are left empty, again like phrase A, but with the second 8 bars we get to see a very common melodic structure. We start with our regular B motif, but then afterwards...
This is really distracting that... I mean, I understand you want to just have music playing, but it's really distracting that every time you put something on screen, the actual music track is in a different place. I feel like if you put this on screen, you should be playing this music.
Get another new variation. Instead of walking down to the second, we jump up to the root, giving the B section as a whole this A-B-A-C call and response.
Like he's talking about this new section, but then in the track, the music is playing the next section. So it's not the section that he's talking about, which is like,
structure. You'll notice that this interval of an upwards fourth is an inverse of the downwards fourth we had in the first half. Sounds
again, he transitioned to earlier in the track, which is not this phrase. Like, if you're actually going to cut to a different part of the track, cut back to the track, cut back to this part, cut back to this section that you're talking about.
Familiar? Limiting the number of musical ideas you use to write a piece is a really good way of focusing the music, even when you're writing variations on your established motifs. This is also the first time Sakuraba starts to play around in all that space he's left himself. We get a variation on a variation, if you will, as this walk down to B is transposed up to bring us back down to our fifth, E.
It's a wrong note.
So here we have our phrase A and our phrase B. These two phrases are given to us in an AABA structure. This is a pretty common structure for musical phrases, sections, or entire pieces, and should be a part of any serious composer's vocabulary. By using this structure, these two sections get us just over a minute of music, but at this point we risk boring the listener if we don't give them something new. Here's where we bring in the C section. It's kind of hard to tell at first listen, but this melody is actually just another variation on our second motif, stretched out into dotted half notes and transposed down a fourth. Stretching out a previous melodic idea into longer note values like this is called augmentation. It's really interesting to hear what it would sound like if Sakuraba had used his first motif for the bridge instead of his second. It just doesn't quite work as well, probably because ascending motion is much better for building tension, which is our goal at this point in the piece. This is also the very first time in the piece that Sakuraba moves away from the tonic A minor chord. Over this section we get a minor 5 chord moving to a minor 4-6 chord. You'll notice that this mirrors our very first motif's 5-4-1 movement. Coincidence? Maybe. I mean, it's a really common harmonic movement, but who knows? It's also worth noting that the C section is set up the same way as our B section, with a motif, variation, motif, new variation structure.
Another neat thing about this section is that this little sort of arpeggiated figure in the bass line is actually, so it's spelling out an E minor chord, E, G, B, but then it also has this C, that 6th scale degree on top, which is the sort of that weird sound of the very beginning of Gwen's theme, the F natural. Let's see if you can see it. Oh, what the heck? Now, where's just like a visualization? Oh, stop. These are not correct. Where's just like a... Yeah, anyway, well, this is not great for seeing it as well, but you can see that it's a minor chord, but there's an F in there, which is that 6th scale degree. So even as he goes into this section, he's stopped using that do 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 that figure, that sort of repetitive figure, and now it's extended out longer into this arpeggiation, just as the motif is extended out longer, but he's still keeping that same basic idea of that minor 6th da 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 instead of da dum. No, it's dum bum. So it's that same idea of a minor chord with the added 6th.
The only difference here is that each variation is pretty simple, only adding a few extra notes at the very end of the phrase. It's little changes like that keep the music from being repetitive. This 1-bar motif got stretched to 4 bars, and the 4 bars got stretched into 16. This is what I mean by getting the most out of your ideas. Now at this point in the piece, we get an 8-bar transition section. It's a cluster chord that gradually builds tension with this dissonant major 7th interval. We're out of the relative somberness of the C section and building intensity towards the piece's climax. After the transition, it's time to kick the piece into high gear. We move back into the B section, only this time forgoing the driving 8th note accompaniment we saw before for the type of cluster chords we saw introduced in that transition section. The phrase is also altered a little bit. Our move to the B in the 5th bar is delayed, and in the second half of the phrase, instead of walking back down from this high A, the melody builds right into it and sticks there, building the intensity going into the next section. The harmony, descending from flat 7 to flat 6 at this point, gives us a little...
Yeah, I really dislike how the music is matched to what he's talking about, because like now I'm hearing the next section and he's talking about this and this. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but that is really distracting. Like if you're explaining something about how the music is put together, either play that section of the music or don't play any music, so that you can like think about it and then play it so that you hear all of that stuff. Don't play other music.
Extra momentum.
And also that's a neat little detail there, that the middle voice actually starts playing this like a little echo of the melody. Boo doo doo. And that chord is the we're all of these like little second things we're or maybe it's the next word that I'm thinking of. Yeah. That chord is basically just the motif put together, stacked vertically. So there's a lot of the same harmonic ideas kind of form the building blocks of other things. It's not just the melody which is using the motifs, it's also the harmony and the accompaniment.
The next section is the climax of the whole piece, a combination of all of the ideas we've been introduced to so far. We get 8 bars of the A section's melody with an additional 3 bars based off of our first motif moved up a step, filling out the empty space. Next, we get the first 4 bars of phrase B repeated. All of this over a minor 5 to minor 4 progression taken from phrase C. Notice how we switch from the pounding cluster chords of the transition section back to our driving 8th note accompaniment from the beginning. This last phrase kind of sputters to a stop, slowing down to try and catch its breath before trying and failing to start back up again. This reinforces the utterly unheroic death of our Lord of Cinder, who desperately fought to delay his inevitable demise, only for his flame to finally sputter out at your hand.
Hey, who do you think you are?
Oh my god, stop.
Music slows down, we go into an entirely new, restrained 8-bar transition section that leads us back to the beginning. So, to ridiculously oversimplify this piece, we have 2 main 3-note motifs, split into 3 sections as well as 2 8-bar transition sections. It's ridiculously hard to write 2.5 minutes of good music, but it's significantly easier to write a 3-note motif, and writing an 8-bar section based on a motif isn't too bad. And if you know different ways to structure 8-bar sections into a song, you all of a sudden can turn a little bit of writing into a lot of music. Just don't forget that the emotional core of a piece is much, much more important than the structure in terms of writing something that people will connect with. Well, I hope that was helpful or interesting or maybe even both. If you liked what you saw and want to support it, consider checking out my Patreon.
Yeah, that was, some things really annoyed me, but that was a really nice explanation of the structure and how he changes the motifs. There's even more going on in there that he didn't really mention, like when you get to that D minor section. You get the middle voice is sort of echoing and mirroring that B motif. You get again that minor 6th in the harmony with the 3-2. What would that be? It's not a suspension. It's a escape tone, I guess. That figure keeps on coming back. So he's like reintroducing different elements. This is the sort of arpeggiated figure from the C section. So he's like combining everything together. It's a bunch of different like building blocks that are being put together, which is it's neat. And this little ending bit always sounds a little bit like the sounds a bit like the character creation music to me. Here we go. Let me find it. So this bit. I don't know if it's just writing in A minor and kind of using this sort of, what would you call that? Like using all the notes of the key. But sounds almost as if it was intentional. There's even an earlier part that kind of has that, let's see. Probably a coincidence, especially since this was written by Takenouchi and not Sakuraba. Okay, well, I think I'm going to leave it there. Yeah, I've seen a few other videos from 8-Bit Music Theory. This one was, whatever this last one was. This one was quite good. Although, the little humorous things really annoy me. I wish he wouldn't do those. And I wish they were a little bit more synchronized with the music and what's playing on screen. You don't need Booger Kid. Yes, agreed. Okay, I'm gonna leave it there. I'll probably be streaming some game tomorrow. If you're in the Discord, you can vote. I think in the suggestions channel. I have a few different options there. All right, take care, everyone.